Hey guys, in today's video we're diving into the most bizarre ancient Roman laws, from strange fashion bans to unexpected social rules, and uncovering the very good reasons they existed. Some of these laws might make you laugh, others might make you uncomfortable, and a few might make you think, wait, should we bring this back? If you enjoy uncovering the strange, the surprising, and the hidden logic of history, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss an episode. And while you're watching, drop a comment below and tell us which Roman rule shocked you the most. Now, grab your toga, step into the streets of ancient Rome, and let's explore the weird rules that helped keep one of history's greatest empires alive. Now, imagine living in a world where what you wear, how you eat, and even how you grieve could be regulated by law. Sounds strange, right? Well, welcome to ancient Rome, a civilization famous for gladiators and emperors, but also for some shockingly weird rules that actually made a lot of sense at the time. Imagine walking through ancient Rome on a cool morning, stone streets still damp from last night's cleaning, shopkeepers pulling open wooden shutters. A senator passes by in flowing white wool, his toga carefully folded, heavy and awkward, but worn with pride. Now imagine someone walking past him, in pants, not a tunic, not a toga, actual trousers. In ancient Rome, that wasn't just a fashion mistake, it was a cultural red flag. For a long time, Romans believed that wearing pants was dangerous, not silly, not unfashionable, dangerous. To us, pants are boring, universal, invisible. But to Romans, trousers called bracca were a symbol of everything Rome feared becoming: foreign, soft, undisciplined. And that fear tells us a lot about how Rome tried to survive its own success. Rome wasn't just a city, it was an idea, a carefully built identity that said, this is what it means to be Roman. And clothing was one of the easiest ways to enforce that identity in a crowded, chaotic place. The toga wasn't comfortable, it wasn't practical, it was hot in summer, heavy in winter, and impossible to work in. But that was the point. A toga showed you had the leisure, wealth, and status to wear something impractical. It marked you as a citizen, a participant in Roman public life, someone who belonged. Pants, on the other hand, came from the north. Gauls wore them, Germans wore them, Celts wore them, people who lived in forests and cold lands, people Rome fought, conquered, and wrote about as wild and uncivilized. So when Romans saw trousers, they didn't think warm legs, they thought barbarian. Clothing was politics you could see from across the street. Rome had no ID cards, no police uniforms in the modern sense, no digital records. If you wanted to know who someone was, you looked at how they dressed. The toga said citizen, purple stripe said rank, simple tunic said laborer or slave, and pants said outsider. Roman writers mocked trousers constantly. They described them as effeminate, as lazy, as proof that northern people lacked Roman self-control. Covering the legs was seen as excessive comfort, and comfort was suspicious. Roman virtue was built around endurance, discipline, the ability to suffer for the state. If you needed pants to stay warm, maybe you weren't tough enough to be Roman. This sounds ridiculous now, but remember where Rome was. At its height, Rome ruled people from Britain to Syria. Dozens of languages, hundreds of local customs, millions of non-Romans living under Roman power. That kind of empire creates anxiety. Rome constantly worried that if it absorbed too much foreign culture, it would stop being Rome. Pants became a symbol of that fear, a small thing that stood for a much bigger question. Who are we, really? So laws and social pressure worked together. In the city of Rome itself, wearing trousers was strongly discouraged and often mocked. Elite Romans avoided them completely. To be seen in pants was to invite suspicion, maybe even accusations of disloyalty. Public life mattered deeply in Rome. Reputation was everything. If you wanted a political career, or even basic respect, you dressed correctly. This wasn't about comfort, it was about conformity. But here's where Rome gets interesting. As the empire expanded, Roman soldiers were sent to colder and colder places. Gaul, Germany, Britain, places where winter didn't care about. Roman ideals. Marching for hours in freezing rain wearing a tunic and bare legs turns pride into frostbite very quickly. So soldiers adapted. Quietly at first, Roman troops began wearing trousers under their armor. Not proudly, not publicly, just practically. At first, this was embarrassing. Elite Romans back home hated it. Writers complained that the army was becoming soft, that Roman discipline was weakening. that the empire was being corrupted by barbarian habits. But reality didn't care. You can't conquer half the world while refusing to stay warm. Over time, trousers became common in the provinces. Soldiers wore them, workers wore them. Eventually, even officials began to accept them outside the city. Rome bent, slowly, reluctantly. But notice something important. The rule didn't vanish overnight. Rome didn't suddenly declare pants acceptable everywhere. Instead, Rome created a split. In the city, tradition; on the frontier, practicality. This is how Rome often survived, by pretending nothing had changed, while quietly changing everything. The toga remained a symbol, pants became a tool. And this tells us something crucial about Roman law. Roman rules weren't always about morality. They were about image, stability, control. Banning pants wasn't about legs. It was about preventing cultural drift in a city already struggling to hold itself together. Rome was crowded, loud, dangerous, full of people who didn't share the same background or values. Visual rules helped keep things predictable. If you could look at someone and instantly know where they stood in society, chaos felt manageable. And pants blurred those lines. They looked foreign, military, provincial. They reminded Romans that their empire was changing faster than their traditions could handle. So Rome resisted, mocked, regulated, until it couldn't anymore. By the later empire, trousers were everywhere. Emperors wore them in portraits from the north. Soldiers wore them openly. The rule faded, not because Rome admitted it was wrong, but because Rome needed to survive the cold. And that's the pattern you'll see again and again. Roman laws often sound absurd to us, too strict, too controlling, too obsessed with appearances. But each one was a response to fear. Fear of disorder, fear of rebellion, fear of losing control over a city that could collapse at any moment. Pants were never just pants. They were a threat to identity in a world where identity was the glue holding everything together. And as Rome learned, even the strongest rules eventually bend when reality pushes hard enough, which raises a question. If Rome fought this hard over clothing, what happened when power itself needed to be marked? For that, we need to talk about color. Specifically, a color so dangerous that most Romans were legally forbidden to touch it. Picture the Roman Forum at midday. Sunlight spills over marble temples. Dust hangs in the air. Hundreds of voices overlap, merchants arguing, lawyers shouting, priests chanting, politicians pretending not to notice any of it. And then you see it. A flash of deep purple cloth moving through the crowd. People step aside without being told. Conversations soften. Heads turn. In ancient Rome, purple didn't just stand out. It commanded space. And that was exactly why most people were not allowed to wear it. Purple was not a color. It was a warning sign. To us, purple is just another option on a shelf. But in Rome, purple dye was one of the most expensive substances on earth. It came from sea snails, tiny ones, thousands of them. Crushed, fermented, and boiled for days to produce a small amount of deep, rich dye called Tyrian purple. The smell was awful. The process was slow. The cost was extreme. One fully purple garment could be worth more than a house. So Rome did what Rome always did with dangerous things. It regulated them, very strictly. In a city of over 1 million people, appearance mattered. Rome had no loudspeakers, no uniforms for authority. No instant way to identify who mattered and who didn't. Color solved that problem. Purple became visual shorthand for power. A narrow purple stripe on a toga meant senator. A slightly different stripe meant equestrian. A full purple cloak meant emperor. These rules were not suggestions. They were enforced by law. If you wore more purple than your rank allowed, you weren't just being flashy. You were impersonating authority. And impersonation was dangerous. Rome feared confusion more than inequality. If anyone could dress like a senator, how would crowds know who to obey? In moments of panic, riots, or fire, hesitation could be deadly. So the law stepped in and said, power must be visible, and visibility must be controlled. Purple was how Rome made hierarchy instantly readable. In the chaos of the streets, one glance could tell you who could command soldiers, who could speak in court, who could ruin your life with a sentence. That clarity kept the city functioning, but purple wasn't just about identification. It was also about restraint. Rome loved to talk about simplicity, about old values, about how their ancestors lived modest lives and conquered the world through discipline. At the same time, Rome was filthy rich. Conquests poured gold, silver, slaves, and luxury goods into the city. The elite competed constantly: bigger houses, bigger banquets, rarer items. That competition scared lawmakers. Too much luxury led to debt. Debt led to corruption. Corruption led to instability. Purple became a pressure valve. By limiting who could wear it, Rome limited how openly wealth could be displayed. You could be rich, but you couldn't look too rich unless the state said you could. Breaking these rules wasn't taken lightly. There are records of people being fined, publicly humiliated, or politically ruined for wearing unauthorized purple. Not because the fabric itself mattered, but because it challenged the system. Clothing was a language. Purple was a sentence. Only a few were allowed to speak. And emperors understood this better than anyone. Once emperors took power, purple became sacred. Imperial purple. A color so closely tied to authority that even touching it improperly could be seen as treason. Later, Roman law would ban anyone but the emperor from wearing fully purple garments. Even possessing them could raise suspicion, because if you looked like the emperor, you might want to be the emperor. This is where fear creeps in. Rome was obsessed with assassination, coups, and rebellion. Emperors rarely died peacefully. Rivals watched for symbols. Support gathered around appearances. Purple could rally loyalty before a word was spoken, so Rome treated color like a weapon. There's something almost modern about this. We still use visual cues to signal authority. Badges, suits, flags, logos, uniforms. Strip those away, and power feels uncertain. Rome understood that deeply. In a loud, crowded city, symbols spoke louder than laws, and like many Roman rules, this one was unevenly enforced. The rich found ways around it. Slightly darker reds, purple linings hidden inside garments. Accessories dyed just enough to suggest status without crossing the line. Everyone pretended not to notice, because the goal wasn't purity, it was balanced. As long as the system looked intact, Rome was satisfied. But over time, the meaning of purple grew heavier, more dangerous, more symbolic. Eventually, emperors would execute rivals simply for dreaming of wearing purple. Color had become destiny. What started as a practical rule to prevent confusion turned into a near-religious obsession with symbolism and control. And that tells us something important. Rome didn't just regulate behavior, it regulated perception. What you saw shaped what you believed, and what you believed shaped how stable the city felt. Purple kept the hierarchy visible. Visibility kept panic in check. And panic, in Rome, was always one bad day away. But clothing wasn't the only place Rome feared excess. If color could destabilize society, imagine what happened when competition moved indoors behind closed doors, around long tables, with wine flowing and egos swelling. Because in Rome, even dinner could be dangerous, and the state knew it. That's why the next rule tried to control something far more tempting than purple cloth. Food. In ancient Rome, a dinner invitation was never just a meal. It was a message. Who you invited, what you served, how much wine flowed, who sat closest to you. All of it mattered, and Rome watched very closely. At first glance, it seemed strange. Why would the state care how much meat someone served at their own table? Why count dishes, cups, guests? But in Rome, dinner was power wearing a smile. Rome's elite loved banquets, long couches, silver plates, exotic foods hauled in from across the empire. Flamingos, dormice, oysters, rare fish, imported wine. These meals weren't about hunger. They were performances. A lavish dinner said, I am rich enough to waste money. It said, I have connections. It said, if you support me, this could be your life too. And that was the problem. Roman politicians didn't campaign the way we do. There were no posters, no ads, no speeches blasted to crowds every night. Influence happened quietly, over food, over wine, over favors. So lawmakers got nervous. Too much luxury led to competition. Competition led to debt. Debt led to bribery and corruption. And corruption, in a city this crowded, could tip everything over. So Rome passed sumptuary laws. These laws set limits on how much you could spend on a dinner, limits on how many guests you could invite, limits on what kinds of food you could serve. Some laws allowed more spending on holidays. Some allowed exceptions for weddings or funerals. Others named specific meats that were banned on ordinary days. Yes, the state decided when you were allowed to serve fancy fish. Inspectors could show up unannounced. Informants could report you. Neighbors listened. Slaves talked. If you went too far, you could be fined, publicly shamed, or politically damaged. The message was clear. Private excess was tolerated. Public excess was dangerous. Why? Because dinner created loyalty. When a powerful man hosted a lavish feast, he wasn't just feeding people, he was building a network. Guests felt indebted, grateful, obligated. In Rome, obligation was currency. Lawmakers feared that uncontrolled banquets could create private power bases stronger than the state itself. A man with enough loyal dinner guests could sway elections, influence juries, stir crowds, so the law tried to flatten the table, at least in public. Of course, everyone cheated. Roman writers loved to complain about it. Elites found clever ways around the rules, serving fewer guests but more expensive food, hosting simple dinners with absurdly rare ingredients, labeling meals as religious ceremonies to bypass limits. It became a game, and Rome knew it. The goal was never perfect enforcement. The goal was signaling. By passing these laws, the state reminded everyone who was watching. Rome was always watching. There was also a moral angle. Romans liked to imagine themselves as descendants of tough farmers, men who conquered the world on bread, olives, and discipline. Luxury felt like decay, so these laws pretended to defend tradition, simplicity, old values, even as Rome drowned in wealth. The irony is thick. The same men voting for dinner limits often hosted the most outrageous feasts in private villas far from the city. But hypocrisy didn't bother Rome much. Order did. A controlled dinner scene meant controlled ambition. Controlled ambition meant fewer surprises. Fewer surprises meant survival. Because Rome had learned something painful. Revolutions don't always start in the streets. Sometimes they start at the table, with laughter, with wine, with promises whispered between courses. That's why Rome tried to regulate dinner, not because food was dangerous, but because people would. And if Rome was willing to count your guests and weigh your roast, it's no surprise they were even stricter about something far more unsettling, death itself. Because in Rome, even where you were allowed to be buried was a matter of law. In ancient Rome, death was everywhere. People died young, from disease, from accidents, from fires, from violence, from things no one fully understood. And yet, there was one place death was not allowed to stay. Inside the city. Roman law was very clear about this. No burials, no cremations, no tombs within the sacred boundary of Rome, called the Pomerium. The dead had to go outside. This wasn't about being heartless. It was about survival. First, there was the obvious problem. Public health. Rome had no modern sanitation, no germ theory, no hospitals as we understand them. The city already struggled with waste, stagnant water, and overcrowding. Letting bodies decompose inside dense neighborhoods would have been a disaster. Cremation was common, but cremation meant fire, and Rome burned easily. Buildings were packed tightly together. Many were made of wood. One stray spark could destroy an entire block, so the law pushed death away from daily life. But there was more going on than hygiene. Romans believed death carried a kind of pollution. Not dirt, exactly. Something spiritual. Something unsettling. The dead belonged to a different realm, and mixing that realm with the living made people nervous. So Rome drew a line. Life inside, death outside, and that line shaped the landscape. If you walked out of Rome along a major road, like the Appian Way, you would pass rows of tombs, small ones, huge ones, family monuments, simple markers. The roads were lined with the dead. Every traveler left the city under their watchful presence. This was intentional. The dead were honored, remembered, displayed, just not allowed to interfere with daily chaos. Rome acknowledged death, but it controlled it. There was also a social reason. Funerals were public events, loud ones, emotional ones. They stopped traffic, drew crowds, sparked speeches. Allowing burials inside the city would have turned grief into constant disruption. Rome couldn't afford that. Life in the city was already fragile. Crowds pressed together. Tempers flared easily. Panic spread fast. Too much mourning could tip into unrest. So death was moved to the edges. Close enough to remember. Far enough to manage. Families visited tombs regularly. They held meals for the dead. Poured wine. Spoke names out loud so the spirits wouldn't be forgotten. But when the rituals ended, they returned to the city of the living. This balance mattered. Rome needed people focused on survival, work, order, not constantly surrounded by reminders of how easily it all ended. There were exceptions, of course, great heroes, legendary figures, occasionally emperors, but even then, Rome argued, debated, hesitated, because breaking this rule felt dangerous. Once death entered the city, where would it stop? So the law held firm for centuries. No matter how rich you were, no matter how powerful your family, the city belonged to the living. This rule tells us something quiet but important about Rome. Rome didn't deny death, it compartmentalized it. And that habit, separating emotion from order, shows up again and again in Roman law, especially when emotions ran high. Because if Rome was careful about where you could bury the dead, it was even more careful about how loudly you were allowed to grieve. Which brings us to one of the strangest rules of all, a law that tried to control sadness itself. In ancient Rome, the state didn't just care about what you wore or where you mourned. It cared about who you married, how many children you had, and even who you loved or didn't love. Yes, in Rome, your private life could be public business, especially under the reign of Augustus, the first emperor, who believed the survival of the empire depended on morality. Augustus introduced a series of laws called the Leges Julia, or Julian laws, which regulated marriage, adultery, and family life. They were designed with one goal in mind, to keep the elite producing children, staying loyal, and obeying the social order. It might sound extreme now, but for Augustus, it was practical. Rome's aristocratic population was shrinking. Fewer children meant fewer heirs, fewer soldiers, and weaker political families. The empire could not survive if the upper class dwindled, so the state stepped in to encourage or sometimes force responsible family life. First, marriage. Romans were expected to marry and produce children. The laws rewarded those who did. Citizens with 3 or more children could receive privileges, tax breaks, or public recognition. Having children was considered a civic duty, not just a personal choice. But the laws were strict in the other direction too. Adultery was illegal, and the penalties could be harsh. Men could prosecute their wives, lovers. Women could be divorced, shamed, or even exiled. Sometimes men were punished too, though often the laws targeted women more directly. The reasoning wasn't cruelty, at least not officially. Adultery threatened alliances, inheritance, and family stability. A child whose paternity was uncertain could disrupt everything from property to political influence. Rome valued certainty, and laws were a tool to enforce it. Interestingly, these laws even reached widows and unmarried adults. If you were of marriageable age and chose to remain single, the law could impose restrictions or penalties. Being single was not just a personal choice, it was considered a potential threat to the state. The Julian laws also included moral policing of public behavior. Extravagance, excess, and sexual freedom were frowned upon. The ideal citizen was disciplined, productive, and loyal. Pleasure was allowed, but carefully measured. There's a certain irony here. The empire that gave us gladiators, banquets, and orgies also passed laws restricting sexual behavior. Rome loved spectacle but feared chaos. Pleasure was fine as long as it didn't threaten order. The laws also had social implications. Families who followed them could rise in influence. Families who ignored them risked shame, fines, or political isolation. Your private life could enhance or damage your public reputation. And of course, enforcement was never uniform. Some citizens found ways around the laws, others took them very seriously. But even inconsistent enforcement sent a message. The state cared about who you loved, and it had the power to intervene. So why did Rome take such a personal interest in morality? Because in a society built on hierarchy and family alliances, disorder in private life could ripple outward. A single scandal could upset marriages, redistribute wealth, or provoke political conflict. Keeping citizens morally in line was a way of keeping the empire stable. Imagine a young Roman citizen in Augustus' Rome. Choosing a spouse wasn't just a matter of love, it was a civic duty. Choosing to remain single or act irresponsibly could be considered selfish or worse, dangerous. And yet, Romans didn't always resent these laws. Many saw them as guidance, as a way to contribute to the city's survival. It reinforced the idea that personal choices were part of a larger social responsibility. There's a gentle humor in imagining this from today's perspective. A Roman teenager, rolling their eyes while a father says, "Remember, Augustus is watching. Marry and have children." Even as laws controlled romance, the ordinary dramas of life went on. Awkward flirtations, secret crushes, and family pressure. The laws couldn't stop love, they just shaped the rules around it. And in this way, Rome extended its control from the streets to the bedrooms, from the forum to the family home. Order was maintained not only in public behavior, but in private life. So as the city slept, citizens followed these invisible rules. Married couples planned families, widows and bachelors adjusted their lives to comply. Even scandalous gossip served a function, reminding everyone of the social expectations. In the next chapter, we move from the private and moral to the festive and culinary, because just as Rome regulated love and marriage, it also regulated what you could not eat. Banquets, feasts, and dinner parties were another arena where law and order quietly guided life. But for now, imagine a quiet Roman street. Couples walk home under the torchlight. Families settle in their homes. Even love, in its chaos and charm, is touched by the invisible hand of law. And Rome, as always, remains steady, orderly, and enduring. In ancient Rome, even your dinner could be illegal. That sounds extreme, but to Romans, it made perfect sense. Banquets weren't just about food, they were a stage, a social signal, and, sometimes, a powder keg waiting to ignite. So the government stepped in to make sure they didn't get out of hand. Romans loved to eat. We're not talking simple meals of bread and olives. We're talking lavish feasts with dozens of dishes, exotic ingredients, and endless wine. Banquets could last hours or even days. And yes, this could get out of control. Imagine a wealthy host serving flaming peacocks, stuffed dormice, and imported delicacies that cost more than a soldier's yearly salary. Neighbors watched. Servants watched. The state watched. Too much extravagance could provoke resentment. The poor might grow jealous. The middle class might feel pressured to compete, and the elite could sink into debt just to show off. So Rome passed laws to keep feasts reasonable. These rules limited the number of guests. They controlled the types of food you could serve. Sometimes they even dictated the amount of wine allowed. Yes, your wine could be illegal. Imagine raising a goblet and realizing your host had violated a centuries-old law. Not only could you be fined, but your reputation could suffer. Being a conspicuous guest at an illegal feast was almost as dangerous as hosting one. The laws weren't just about economics or morality, they were about social stability. Rome knew that extreme displays of wealth caused friction. A lavish banquet could spark arguments, envy, or even riots. By regulating food and drink, the state kept the peace. Surveillance was subtle but effective. Neighbors might report violations. Magistrates could show up unexpectedly. And wealthy hosts, aware of the risks, often toned down their feasts just enough to stay safe. Food restrictions also served practical purposes. Rome was a crowded city. Imported delicacies needed transport, storage, and preservation. Overindulgence in rare foods could strain the supply chain. By limiting extravagance, the state helped prevent shortages. And then there was debt. Rich Romans could spend fortunes on a single banquet. Banks and lenders encouraged this behavior, but unchecked debt could destabilize families and, by extension, the city. Laws controlling feasts were an early form of financial regulation. It wasn't all about punishment. The regulations guided behavior and rewarded moderation. Hosts who respected limits were admired. They were seen as disciplined, responsible, and, importantly, loyal citizens. There's a subtle humor in imagining this. A guest sits down, eyeing the roasted peacock, and whispers, "Careful. Last time Gaius overspent. The magistrate fined him enough to buy 3 villas." Even indulgence had boundaries. The laws also shaped etiquette. How you ate, how you served, and even how you sat could matter. Tables were organized by rank, and violating the seating order could offend not just your host, but the law itself. Banquets became exercises in discipline disguised as luxury. And yet, the Romans still found joy in food. The laws didn't make life bland, they structured it. They turned banquets into a predictable social ritual rather than a chaotic gamble. In some ways, it's like a modern city regulating restaurants. Health codes, occupancy limits, and liquor licenses all shape how we enjoy food safely. Rome was doing the same thing, just with more roasted dormice. So as night fell and torches lit the banquet halls, Romans dined with awareness. Every bite was a reminder of order. Every cup of wine measured, yet still pleasurable. Even indulgence served the state. By keeping banquets in check, Rome maintained economic stability, social hierarchy, and public peace, all without spoiling the joy of the meal. In the next chapter, we'll step outside the banquet hall and into the streets, where buildings, construction, and even demolition were governed by law. Rome controlled everything from feasts to architecture to ensure the city remained safe, orderly, and enduring. But for now, picture a Roman evening feast. Guests laugh quietly, careful not to offend. Torches flicker across golden plates. The aroma of roasted meats fills the room. And through it all, the invisible hand of law guides every bite, keeping the city and its citizens bound. In ancient Rome, even buildings were not entirely private property. You could own a house. Yes, you could live in it, rent it, inherit it, but you could not do whatever you wanted with it. Rome was a crowded city, very crowded. Streets were narrow. Homes were stacked upward, sometimes 6 or 7 stories high. Wooden beams, oil lamps, and cooking fires were everywhere, and fires were a constant nightmare. If one building burned, it could take an entire neighborhood with it. So Rome decided that architecture needed rules, strict ones. One of the strangest to modern ears was this: you were often required to reuse old buildings and materials instead of tearing everything down and starting fresh. This wasn't about nostalgia, it was about survival. First, fire prevention. Rome had learned the hard way that uncontrolled construction was dangerous. Buildings built too tall collapsed. Cheap materials burned quickly. Narrow alleys turned into fire tunnels. So laws were passed, limiting how high buildings could be. Walls had to be a certain thickness. Materials had to meet specific standards. And if you wanted to demolish a structure, you often needed permission. Tearing down a building created debris, dust, and risk. Reusing existing walls and stone was safer. It also reduced construction time, which meant fewer exposed hazards. Second, material scarcity. Stone was valuable. Timber had to be transported from far away. Bricks required labor, kilns, and fuel. Rome could not afford waste. So when a building was damaged or outdated, the law often encouraged repair over replacement. Old stone blocks were reused, columns were repurposed. Foundations stayed in place for generations. This is why many Roman buildings feel layered. A wall from one century might support a structure from another. The city was constantly rebuilding itself, but rarely from scratch. Third, urban overcrowding. Rome was bursting at the seams. If everyone rebuilt freely, streets would shift, alleys would narrow, and access routes would disappear. That mattered during emergencies. Firefighters, known as the vigils, needed clear paths. Soldiers needed space to move. Carts had to pass through. So the law controlled not just what you built, but where and how. Building inspections were real. Officials checked measurements. They fined owners who violated limits. Sometimes, illegal construction was torn down at the owner's expense. Imagine waking up to discover that part of your new balcony was illegal and had to be removed. Rome did not negotiate much on safety. There were also laws about shared walls. In a dense city, many buildings touched each other. If you damaged a shared wall, you could endanger multiple families. So repairs had to follow rules. Neighbors had legal rights. Disputes were settled by magistrates. Your house was part of a larger system. Individual freedom ended where collective risk began. And then there were the insular apartment buildings for the lower and middle classes. These were often poorly built, overcrowded, and dangerous. They collapsed, they caught fire, they killed people. After several disasters, Rome tightened regulations. Height limits were enforced more strictly. Owners were held responsible for safety. Neglect could lead to punishment. Once again, the pattern appears. Rome did not wait for modern engineering knowledge. It reacted to experience. People died. Buildings failed. So the law adjusted. There's a quiet practicality here that's easy to miss. Rome understood that private ambition could harm public safety. A landlord who built cheaply endangered tenants. A developer who built too high endangered the street. So the law said, you may profit, but not at the city's expense. Even emperors followed these rules, at least in theory. Augustus famously bragged that he found Rome a city of brick and left it a city of marble. But even that transformation followed regulations. Stability came before beauty. There's also something almost comforting about this approach. Rome did not chase constant novelty. It reused, it repaired, it adapted. Old structures were not seen as failures. They were resources. A temple might become a storehouse. A home might become a shop. A ruined wall might support a new roof. The city aged, but it did not collapse. And here's a small moment of humor. Imagine a Roman homeowner complaining, "My great-grandfather built this wall, and I'm still legally required to keep it." The law had a long memory, but that long memory helped Rome survive fires, earthquakes, and time itself. As night falls, imagine walking through a Roman neighborhood. Walls bear scars of past repairs. Stones don't match perfectly. Nothing is brand new, yet everything holds. The buildings lean on each other, just like the people inside them, held together by habit, law, and necessity. In the next chapter, we will look at a group often denied humanity and yet protected by law in surprising ways, because even slavery in Rome was regulated. But for now, picture the city standing quietly, layer upon layer of stone, old walls supporting new lives, a city that survives not by tearing itself down, but by carefully rebuilding again and again. And slowly, under the weight of history and law, Rome rests. In ancient Rome, slavery was everywhere. In homes, in shops, on farms, in mines, in the army camps. Slaves cooked meals, cleaned floors, taught children, ran businesses, and even managed finances. They were so deeply woven into daily life that Rome could not function without them. And yet, here is the part that surprises many people. Even slaves had legal protections, not because Rome was kind, not because it believed in equality, but because cruelty, if left unchecked, was dangerous. To understand this, we have to remember one thing. Rome was always afraid of rebellion. Slaves outnumbered free citizens in many areas. They came from conquered lands, spoke different languages, and carried memories of freedom. If they united, Rome would be in serious trouble. So the state took an interest in how slaves were treated. Early on, slaves were considered property. A master could punish or even kill a slave without legal consequence. But over time, this changed. Not suddenly, not out of compassion, but out of necessity. Rome learned, slowly and painfully, that extreme cruelty created desperate people, and desperate people rebel. So laws began to appear that limited what masters could do. One of the most important changes was the restriction on killing slaves. In later periods, a master who killed a slave without cause could face punishment. The state claimed an interest in the life of the slave. This was a big shift. It meant that a slave was no longer just private property. They were part of the public order. If a master abused slaves too openly, neighbors could report it. Officials could intervene. In extreme cases, slaves could be removed from a household. This was not common, but it mattered that it was possible. Rome was sending a message. Cruelty that threatens stability will not be tolerated. Another reason for slave protections was economic. Slaves were expensive. They were trained. They represented long-term investment. A dead slave was wasted money. A tortured slave was a broken worker. The state preferred productive labor to violent discipline. So some laws encouraged moderation. Masters were expected to feed slaves adequately. Overworking them to death was discouraged. Public outrage over extreme abuse could damage a master's reputation. Reputation mattered deeply in Rome. A man known for cruelty was seen as undisciplined, and lack of discipline was a moral failing. There were also rules about collective punishment. If a master was murdered, the household slaves could be executed. This sounds brutal, and it was, but even here, Rome later introduced limits. Mass executions caused fear and resentment. Fear bred instability. So investigations became more careful. Not every slave was automatically blamed. Again, Rome adjusted when fear outweighed control. Slaves also had limited legal recognition in other ways. They could not marry legally, but informal family units were often acknowledged. Separating slave families without reason could attract criticism. Children born to slaves were still slaves, but their value was recognized. This might sound cold, and it was. But it also meant that Rome had an incentive to keep slave households stable. Stable households meant calmer people. There's a quiet irony here. Rome, which denied slaves freedom, still understood their humanity well enough to fear their anger. The law became a tool to manage that fear. Some slaves could even earn money. They might run shops, manage estates, or handle accounts. They could save toward eventual freedom. Manumission being freed was common enough to be regulated. Freed slaves became freedmen with limited rights. They owed loyalty to their former masters, but they were no longer property. The state supported this system because it encouraged obedience. Work hard, behave well, and freedom might come. Hope is a powerful control mechanism. Of course, not all slaves were treated well. Abuse still happened. Cruelty still existed. But the presence of laws mattered. They set boundaries. They reminded masters that absolute power was risky. They reminded slaves that the state was watching at least a little. There's also something important to understand about Roman thinking. Rome did not see itself as evil for having slaves. Slavery was normal. It was ancient. It was universal. What Rome feared was disorder. A master who whipped a slave in private might be ignored. A master who tortured slaves publicly threatened social peace. So the law drew a line not at morality, but at stability. Imagine a Roman street. A slave stumbles under a heavy load. A master shouts. Neighbors glance over. If the punishment becomes too violent, it draws attention. Attention leads to whispers. Whispers lead to unrest. Rome preferred quiet obedience to loud cruelty. Even emperors recognized this. Some issued decrees protecting slaves from extreme abuse, not out of mercy, but because an empire built on fear alone does not last. Fear must be balanced with predictability, and laws create predictability. There is a strange calmness in this system. Everyone knew the limits. Masters knew how far they could go. Slaves knew what behavior might earn protection or punishment. It was not fair, but it was stable. As night falls in Rome, slaves finish their work. Some sleep in kitchens, some in storage rooms, some in crowded quarters beneath the house. Their lives are hard. Their freedom is gone. But even here, law exists. Not to save them, not to free them, but to keep the city from tearing itself apart. In the next chapter, we will look at another powerful boundary Rome controlled very carefully. Who was allowed to be Roman at all? Citizenship was not given freely. It was guarded, expanded slowly, and tied tightly to loyalty. But for now, imagine the quiet end of the day. Oil lamps dim, footsteps fade. In a city built on conquest, even those without freedom are folded into the system of order. And Rome, always watchful, sleeps held together by fear, habit, and law. In ancient Rome, not everyone was Roman, and becoming Roman was not easy. Citizenship was not just a label. It was one of the most valuable things the empire could offer. Rights, protections, status, a place inside the system instead of beneath it. So Rome guarded citizenship carefully. To modern ears, this might sound unfair or exclusionary, but to Rome, it was another form of control, and control meant survival. Rome began as a small city-state. Citizenship was once limited to a narrow group of families. As Rome expanded, conquering lands across Italy and beyond, a problem emerged. What do you do with millions of people who now live under your rule, but are not Roman? Give citizenship to everyone, and it loses meaning. Give it to no one, and rebellion grows. So Rome chose the slow path. Citizenship became something to be earned, granted, or inherited, but rarely given freely. At first, only native-born Romans had full rights. Others, foreigners, allies, conquered peoples had partial status. They could live in Roman territory, trade, and work, but they lacked political power. This wasn't cruelty for cruelty's sake. It was strategy. Rome wanted loyalty before inclusion. Citizenship brought privileges, but it also brought obligations. Citizens paid taxes. They served in the army. They obeyed Roman law fully. Granting citizenship to someone meant trusting them with the empire's future. So Rome watched carefully. Some cities were rewarded with citizenship for loyalty. Others waited generations. Sometimes entire communities were promoted together. Other times, individuals earned it through military service or public work. Citizenship became a carrot. Fight for Rome, pay your dues, respect Roman customs, and one day you might belong. This system had a calming effect. Instead of constant rebellion, many conquered people worked toward inclusion. They learned Latin. They adopted Roman dress. They followed Roman laws. Rome didn't erase cultures overnight. It absorbed them slowly. But there was always fear. Fear of dilution. Roman elites worried that too many new citizens would weaken tradition. They feared losing control of elections. They feared outsiders reshaping Roman identity. So laws defined citizenship very precisely. Who your parents were mattered. Where you were born mattered. Whom you married mattered. Marriage to a Roman citizen could grant partial rights, but not always full citizenship. Children's status depended on legal details that could decide their entire future. Lawyers thrived in this environment. One missing document could mean the difference between protection and punishment. Citizens had legal rights, others did not. A citizen could not be tortured without trial. A citizen could appeal a sentence. A citizen had access to courts and protections. Non-citizens often did not. This created a clear boundary. You either stood inside the law's full protection, or you stood outside it. And Rome liked boundaries. Boundaries created predictability. Over time, citizenship expanded. Italy was granted citizenship broadly after fierce resistance. Later, provinces gained access in stages. Freed slaves could become citizens, though with limits. Their children often gained fuller rights. Each expansion was deliberate. Rome watched the effects. If order held, expansion continued. If unrest followed, the process slowed. Even emperors debated this constantly. Too much inclusion too fast could destabilize politics. Too little inclusion could fuel resentment. It was a careful balancing act. There's a quiet humor in imagining the paperwork. A man stands before an official, documents in hand, hoping to prove his worth. Years of service, proof of loyalty, witnesses to his character, citizenship interviews, Roman style. And once granted, citizenship changed everything. Your clothing options changed. Your legal standing improved. Your children's futures shifted. You were now part of the machine, not just fuel for it. Rome used this system brilliantly. Instead of ruling only through fear, it ruled through aspiration. People wanted to be Roman. They wanted the order, the protection, the identity. Citizenship became a powerful glue. But Rome never forgot the danger of overextension. Even as late as the empire's height, citizenship laws remained complex. Eligibility was debated. Rights were tiered. Privileges were conditional. Until, finally, one emperor made a radical choice. In the year 212, Emperor Caracalla granted citizenship to nearly all free inhabitants of the empire. It sounds generous, it sounds modern, but even this had practical reasons. More citizens meant more taxpayers, more legal uniformity, more control. Citizenship was no longer rare, but by then, the empire was already changing. The earlier system had done its work. For centuries, Rome expanded not just by conquest, but by controlled inclusion. It turned enemies into allies, allies into citizens, citizens into defenders of the system. As night settles over the empire, imagine a man standing on a road far from Rome itself. He speaks Latin with an accent. He wears Roman clothes. He follows Roman law. And tomorrow, he will officially become Roman. Not because Rome is kind, but because Rome is careful. In the next chapter, we will see how that care extended even to sound itself. Because in Rome, noise, speech, and silence were all regulated by law. But for now, imagine the quiet pride of belonging. A name added to a register, a boundary crossed. Rome grows not by chaos, but by rules. In ancient Rome, silence was not just the absence of sound. It was a legal condition. That may sound strange at first. After all, Rome was loud. Markets shouted from dawn to dusk. Metal rang from workshops. Carts rattled over stone streets. Vendors argued. Animals cried. Crowds roared. Noise was everywhere. And that was exactly the problem. Rome was a city that depended on communication, ritual, and authority. Too much noise, at the wrong moment, could weaken all three. So the Romans did something very Roman. They wrote laws about when you were allowed to speak, when you were required to be quiet, and when silence itself was mandatory. Not polite silence, legal silence. One of the most important places where silence mattered was the courtroom. Roman courts were public. They took place in open spaces, often outdoors. Crowds gathered to watch trials the way we might watch a show. And like any crowd, things could get noisy. People shouted support. Others mocked speakers. Friends of the accused might cheer. Enemies might interrupt. This chaos threatened justice. Rome believed that law only worked if it was heard clearly. So regulations were put in place. Interrupting a magistrate could bring punishment. Disrupting a speaker could result in fines. Excessive noise could lead to removal or, worse. Silence was not about politeness. It was about authority. If a magistrate spoke, the city listened. And this extended beyond courts. Silence was critical during religious rituals. Roman religion depended on precision. Words had to be spoken exactly right. Movements had to be correct. Timing mattered. A single mistake could invalidate a ritual. And noise was one of the biggest threats. During sacrifices, prayers, and auguries, silence was enforced. Attendants called for quiet. Crowds hushed. Even coughing at the wrong moment could be considered bad luck. If a loud noise interrupted a prayer, the entire ritual might have to be repeated. That meant delays, costs, anxiety. Worse, it could be interpreted as a sign of divine displeasure. So silence became sacred. The law supported this by punishing intentional disruptions. Disturbing a ritual was not just rude, it was dangerous. Rome believed the gods protected the city, but only if properly respected. Noise threatened that protection. Silence also mattered in politics. Public assemblies were allowed by nature. Citizens debated, voted, and argued openly. But even here, sound was regulated. There were rules about when people could speak, Who could address the crowd? How long speeches could last? Heckling existed, but too much could lead to punishment. Inciting chaos through noise could be seen as sedition. Rome understood crowd psychology well. A loud crowd could become an angry crowd. An angry crowd could become a violent one. So officials worked to keep noise within boundaries. Even applause could be guided. Yes, Romans sometimes organized applause. Supporters were placed strategically. Cheering was encouraged at certain moments. Silence at others. It sounds manipulative, and it was, but it worked. Silence wasn't always required. Sometimes, controlled noise was useful, but uncontrolled noise, that was a threat. There were also laws about nighttime noise. Rome slept lightly. Fires often started at night. Crimes were easier to commit in the dark. Emergency calls needed to be heard clearly. So unnecessary noise after certain hours could bring trouble. Shouting in the streets at night attracted attention. Playing loud instruments could draw fines. Disruptive behavior after dark was suspicious by default. Silence at night was part of public safety. And remember, there were no sirens, radios, or streetlights. Sound was information. A scream meant danger. A crash meant fire. A horn meant movement. If the city was always loud, those signals would be lost. So silence created contrast. It allowed important sounds to stand out. Rome also regulated who was allowed to speak publicly. Not everyone had equal voice. Women, slaves, and non-citizens were often restricted in public speech. Speaking out of turn could be punished. This wasn't because Romans thought silence was virtuous for everyone. It was because speech was power. Allowing everyone to speak freely risked undermining hierarchy, and hierarchy mattered. If a slave shouted accusations in public, it could stir unrest. If a woman spoke politically, it could challenge tradition. If a foreigner criticized policy, it could spark tension. So the law limited voices to preserve order. This doesn't mean people never spoke. They did constantly, but the public, official voice of Rome was controlled. There's a quiet irony here. Rome loved rhetoric. It celebrated great speakers. Orators were admired. Words shaped careers. And yet, those words existed inside strict boundaries. Freedom of speech existed, but only for those authorized to use it. Even teachers and philosophers had limits. Some ideas were tolerated, others were watched closely. Speech that threatened stability could lead to exile. Again, Rome was not chasing truth for its own sake. It was chasing calm. Silence also played a role in military life. Orders had to be heard. Signals had to be clear. Talking out of turn could cause confusion. Confusion could cause death. So discipline included silence. Soldiers learned when to speak and when not to. The same logic applied to the city itself. Rome was a giant machine. Noise was friction. Silence was lubrication. There is something almost modern about this. Today, we regulate noise with laws about quiet hours, court decorum, and public disruption. Rome was doing the same thing without microphones, walls, or insulation. Just rules. Imagine walking through Rome at dawn. Shops are closed, streets are quiet, footsteps echo. This silence is not accidental. It is enforced, expected, understood. Then the city wakes. Noise returns, measured, familiar. Vendors call out. Tools strike stone. Voices rise, but certain places remain quiet. The courtroom, the temple, the moment of prayer. Silence moves through the city like an invisible law, and people obey it, mostly without thinking. That's when you know a rule has truly worked. It no longer feels like control. It feels like habit, and habit is Rome's greatest achievement. By regulating sound, Rome regulated attention. By regulating attention, it regulated behavior. By regulating behavior, it maintained order. Even something as simple as quiet had a purpose. As evening comes, the noise softens. Shops close, crowds thin, voices lower. Night watchmen, listen carefully. The city does not sleep deeply, it listens. In the next chapter, we will look at a group who was seen, cheered, and adored, yet legally shunned and dishonored. Gladiators, men who lived in noise and applause, but were denied respect by the law itself. But for now, let the city grow quiet. Stone walls hold the day's echoes. Torches flicker, footsteps fade, and Rome rests, protected not just by walls and soldiers, but by silence, carefully written into law. In ancient Rome, few people were more famous than gladiators. Their names were scratched into walls. Their faces appeared on lamps and cups. Crowds screamed for them. Children played games pretending to be them. And yet, by law, Gladiators were considered dishonorable, not heroes, not role models, not even fully respectable people. They were admired loudly and rejected quietly. This was not an accident, it was a rule. Rome loved gladiators, but it did not want to become them, so the law created a strange balance: maximum spectacle, minimum status. To understand why, we need to understand how Romans thought about honor. In Roman culture, honor came from self-control. A good citizen was disciplined, measured, useful to the state. A man who fought because he had to, like a soldier, could be honorable. A man who fought because he was paid to entertain was not. That difference mattered deeply. Gladiators fought for applause, for survival, for money, and that made them dangerous to Rome's moral system. Legally, most gladiators were classified as infames. This status stripped them of important rights. They could not vote. They could not hold office. Their testimony in court was often considered unreliable. Even freeborn men who volunteered to become gladiators lost their legal honor. The moment they signed the contract, they stepped outside respectable society. This was deliberate. Rome wanted the violence but not the values that came with it. Gladiators were allowed to bleed so citizens would not have to, and that separation had to stay clear. The law reinforced it constantly. Gladiators were owned or contracted by trainers called lanistae, who themselves were socially despised. Owning human beings for spectacle was profitable but dirty. Even senators who funded games avoided close association with the fighters. They paid, they watched, they applauded, but they did not mix. This legal distance served a purpose. Gladiators were extremely popular. If they were also honorable citizens, they could become political threats. Imagine a man with massive public support, physical strength, and no loyalty to elite norms. That's not a hero. That's a potential rebel. Rome had seen this before. Popular generals already scared the Senate. A popular fighter class with legal rights would be worse. So the law made sure admiration had no power. You could cheer a gladiator. You could love him, but you could not follow him. Another reason for this rule was control. Gladiators lived violent lives. They trained for killing. They were accustomed to blood. They often came from enslaved or criminal backgrounds. Rome did not want that mindset spreading. By branding gladiators as socially inferior, the law discouraged imitation. Young men might admire them, but they were warned, legally and socially, not to be them. Parents did not want their sons choosing that path. The message was clear. This life is exciting, but it is not respectable. Even gladiators who gained freedom faced limits. Some were granted rudis, a wooden sword symbolizing release. They were no longer enslaved. They could earn money. They could even train others. But the stain of infamia often remained. Freedom did not equal full acceptance. Rome believed that once honor was lost, it could rarely be fully restored. There is also the moral angle. Romans believed violence was necessary, but only in controlled contexts. War was acceptable. Punishment was acceptable. Entertainment violence was tolerated, but morally suspect. Gladiators existed in a gray zone. They were not criminals being punished. They were not soldiers serving Rome. They were performers of death. That unsettled Roman philosophers. Some praised gladiatorial courage. Others condemned the games as corrupting. The law sided with caution. It allowed the games but limited their influence. Even clothing played a role. Gladiators were marked visually. Their scars were obvious. Their bodies were shaped by training. Their equipment identified them instantly. You could see who they were. And that visibility reinforced separation. A Roman citizen in a toga was dignity. A gladiator in armor was spectacle. They belonged to different worlds even when standing feet apart. Interestingly, this rule also protected gladiators in a strange way. Because they were legally outside honor, they were not expected to behave like citizens. They could do things others could not. They could fight without shame. They could earn through violence. They could exist without pretending to be morally pure. Rome needed somewhere to put its darker instincts. Gladiators were that place. The law created a container for brutality. Inside the arena, violence was allowed, even celebrated. Outside it, violence remained controlled. This separation kept society stable. If everyone was allowed to chase fame through blood, Rome would collapse. So the law said, only these people may do this, and they will never be us. There was also fear of emotional attachment. Crowds bonded deeply with fighters. Fans followed careers. They mourned deaths. They celebrated victories. If gladiators gained political rights, emotional loyalty could turn into real power. Rome did not want that. So admiration stayed one-sided. Cheer, but do not elevate. Love, but do not respect. This sounds cruel and it was, but from Rome's perspective, it was practical. The empire survived by placing hard limits on influence. Not everyone who was loved was allowed to lead, and gladiators were loved intensely. Some even had fan clubs. Women reportedly collected their sweat. Graffiti declared devotion. Merchandise was sold. This popularity terrified conservative elites. The law was the wall between fascination and chaos. Even emperors had to tread carefully. A few famously fought as gladiators themselves. This shocked Roman society, not because fighting was illegal, but because it broke the rule of separation. An emperor was supposed to embody dignity. Entering the arena blurred lines that were meant to stay firm. Many Romans saw this as a sign of decline. When rulers crossed into dishonor, the system trembled. That reaction tells us how strong this rule really was. It wasn't just about gladiators. It was about protecting Roman identity. Honor meant restraint. Power meant control. Violence was a tool not of value. By legally degrading gladiators, Rome told itself a story. We enjoyed this, but we are better than this. Whether that was true is another matter. As the games grew larger and bloodier, critics grew louder. Some questioned whether the line still held. But for centuries, the law did its job. It kept admiration from becoming imitation. It kept entertainment from becoming ideology. And it kept violence in its place. As the sun set over the amphitheater, crowds poured out. They talked excitedly. They laughed. They argued over fights. Then they went home. The gladiators stayed behind. Treated, locked in, separated, loved by thousands, honored by none. Rome slept easily, knowing the boundary held. In the next chapter, we leave the roar of the arena and enter a quieter, smellier, but equally important part of Roman life. Toilets, sewers, and the laws that kept 1 million people from drowning in their own waste. For now, the arena empties. The sand is raked smooth. Blood disappears beneath fresh layers, and Rome moves on order intact. Spectacle contained, honor carefully guarded by law. Ancient Rome had many impressive achievements: roads, aqueducts, armies, law, but none of those mattered much if the city drowned in its own waste. Rome was huge. At its height, over 1 million people lived packed together inside stone walls. That meant food going in and waste coming out. A lot of it. Without strict rules, Rome would not have smelled like an empire. It would have smelled like disaster. So yes, the Romans had laws about toilets. Very serious laws, because sanitation was not about comfort, it was about survival. Most Romans did not have private bathrooms. Instead, they used public latrines, long stone benches with holes. No dividers, no privacy, just rows of people doing their business together. This sounds awkward to us. To Romans, it was normal, but shared toilets created shared problems. If latrines overflowed, disease spread. If they clogged, wastes backed up into streets. If they were damaged, entire neighborhoods suffered. So the state took control. Public latrines were regulated, inspected, and maintained by law. Someone was always responsible. Often, that someone was a local official or a wealthy patron who funded the facility. If a latrine fell into disrepair, fines followed. Cleanliness was not optional. Rome also built one of the most advanced sewer systems in the ancient world. The most famous was the Cloaca Maxima. Originally a drainage channel, it became a massive underground sewer. It carried waste, rainwater, and runoff away from the city and into the river. This system saved Rome countless times, but only if it worked. So there were laws protecting it. Throwing large debris into sewers was illegal. Damaging sewer access points was punishable. Blocking water flow could bring serious penalties. Why so strict? Because a broken sewer did not affect one person. It affected everyone. Flooded streets spread filth. Standing waste attracted rats and insects. Disease followed quickly. Rome did not understand germs, but it understood patterns. Dirty cities got sick. Sick cities panicked. Panicked cities rebelled. Sanitation was political stability. Even human waste itself was regulated. In one of Rome's strangest systems, urine was collected and reused. Public urinals existed not just for convenience, but for industry. Urine was valuable. It contained ammonia, which was useful for cleaning cloth and tanning leather, so Rome taxed it. Yes, there was literally a urine tax. Collectors gathered urine from designated locations. Businesses bought it. The state took a cut. This system required rules where urine could be collected, who could collect it, who owned it once deposited. It sounds funny now, But at the time, it was efficient. Waste became resource, and resources were regulated. Even dumping waste improperly could bring punishment. You could not just throw filth into the street, at least not legally. If waste injured someone, the owner of the building could be held responsible. Imagine walking under an apartment window and getting hit by something unpleasant. That happened. So Rome passed laws assigning liability. If your building dumped waste onto the street and hurt someone, you paid. That encouraged better behavior, or at least more careful aim. Rome also regulated water access tightly. Aqueducts brought clean water into the city. That water fed fountains, baths, and latrines. Blocking or stealing water was a serious crime. Private citizens were not allowed to tap into public water lines freely. Unauthorized pipes could be removed. Owners could be fined or punished. Why? Because water pressure mattered. If too many people stole water, the system failed. Latrines dried up. Sewers stopped flowing. Waste accumulated. Again, one person's shortcut became everyone's problem. Bathhouses, another major feature of Roman life, were also regulated. They were not just for bathing, they were social centers, but they used enormous amounts of water, so the state controlled hours, maintenance, and access. Baths had to drain properly. Wastewater had to flow into approved channels. Flooding was unacceptable. An overflowing bath could damage nearby buildings, and damage meant lawsuits. Rome loved lawsuits. Sanitation laws were enforced through fines, inspections, and public accountability. This is important. Rome did not rely on kindness. It relied on consequence. If you neglected your sewer connection, you paid. If you damaged public sanitation, you paid more. If people got sick because of you, you paid even more. These laws shaped behavior slowly, but effectively. There was also a religious layer. Waste was considered polluting not just physically, but spiritually. Certain rituals required cleanliness. You could not approach temples covered in filth. Polluted spaces offended the gods, so sanitation protected divine favor as well. Clean water meant clean rituals. Clean rituals meant protected city. Everything connected. Even graveyards and waste disposal overlapped in regulation. You could not dump waste near burial areas. You could not bury bodies near water sources. The dead and the dirty had boundaries. Rome enforced those boundaries. One fascinating detail is how communal responsibility worked. Entire neighborhoods could be fined if sanitation failed. This encouraged peer pressure. If one person caused problems, neighbors corrected them fast. Nobody wanted to pay for someone else's mess, literally. Sanitation workers existed too. Often enslaved or lower class, they cleaned latrines and maintained sewers. Their work was essential and dangerous. The law offered some protections. Interfering with sanitation work could bring penalties. Even elites respected these workers, if only quietly. They understood the stakes. When sanitation failed, Rome suffered. We know this because during times of war, neglect, or political collapse, sanitation systems broke down, and disease followed. Plagues hit hardest where water systems failed. Romans learned from this. Hard lessons stick. That is why sanitation laws remained strong for centuries. Even as emperors changed, even as borders shifted, the pipes stayed. There is something very Roman about this chapter. Not glamorous, not heroic, but absolutely essential. Rome did not survive because it was beautiful. It survived because it functioned. And nothing tested function like waste. Every citizen contributed. Every citizen depended on the system. Sanitation laws reminded Romans of a simple truth. You live together or you die together. That idea shaped the empire. As night fell, water continued to flow. Sewers carried the day away. Latrines emptied. Streets cooled. Most Romans never thought about these systems. That was the point. When a rule works perfectly, you forget it exists. You just notice when it fails. Rome noticed, and it wrote laws to make sure failure stayed rare. In the next chapter, we move from waste to work, markets, shopkeepers, and the surprising rule that forced businesses to stay open even when they wanted to close. For now, the city breathes easier. Water moves, waste disappears, and Rome sleeps cleanly, held together by stone, law, and an impressive amount of plumbing. In ancient Rome, closing your shop was not always your decision. That sounds harsh, and sometimes it was. But Rome was not trying to punish shopkeepers. It was trying to stop panic. Because in a city of over 1 million people, an empty market was not just inconvenient, it was dangerous. Rome depended on constant movement of goods, grain, oil, wine, vegetables, tools, fuel. If those stopped flowing, even briefly, fear spread faster than hunger. So the state stepped in. Markets were regulated by law, and shopkeepers were often required to stay open during certain hours, especially during shortages or crises. This was not about free choice. It was about survival. Rome had learned something the hard way. People do not riot when food runs out. They riot when they think food is running out. A closed shop window could cause rumors. Rumors caused crowds. Crowds caused violence. So Rome treated markets like infrastructure, not private hobbies. One of the biggest concerns was grain. Grain fed the city. Bread was the backbone of Roman life. No bread meant unrest. No unrest lasted long before turning political. That is why the grain supply was closely controlled by the state. Shopkeepers who sold grain were under special pressure. They had fixed prices, fixed hours, fixed expectations. If they closed without permission, suspicion followed. Were they hoarding, waiting for prices to rise, trying to profit from hunger? Those were serious accusations. Hoarding was illegal, not discouraged, illegal. If caught stockpiling food to manipulate prices, shopkeepers faced fines, confiscation, or worse. Rome did not trust the market to regulate itself during crisis. It trusted law and fear of punishment. This applied not only to grain sellers, but to many essential trades: bakers, butchers, oil merchants, fuel sellers. These businesses formed the city's nervous system. If one part shut down, the rest felt it. So Rome enforced mandatory operating hours, especially during daylight. Closing early could bring penalties. Repeated offenses could bring inspections, and inspections were never pleasant. Officials, known as Edos, oversaw markets. They checked weights and measures. They monitored prices. They enforced cleanliness. They also made sure shops were open. If a vendor tried to disappear during a shortage, the aediles noticed. Rome understood incentives very well. Left alone, sellers might wait for prices to rise, but price spikes led to unrest. So the state capped prices during emergencies. This was not subtle economics. It was blunt force stability. Keep prices low, keep shops open, keep people calm. Shopkeepers did not always like this. Margins were thin, costs were high, but Rome did not ask whether they liked it. It asked whether the city stayed fed. There were also rules about where goods could be sold. Certain items had designated markets: fish markets, meat markets, vegetable stalls. Selling outside approved areas could bring fines. This helped with sanitation, inspection, and crowd control. If everyone sold everything everywhere, chaos followed. Rome preferred predictable chaos. Markets were noisy, crowded, and messy but organized. That organization came from law. Another reason for forced opening was visibility. An open shop reassured people. It signaled normality. Even if goods were limited, seeing sellers present calmed nerves. A closed street felt abandoned. An abandoned street felt unsafe. Rome knew this instinctively. That is why shops often opened early, even before customers arrived. Presence mattered. Rome also regulated pricing transparency. Prices were often displayed publicly. Changing prices too often raised suspicion. Sudden increases could lead to investigation. Again, this was about trust. If people trusted the market, they stayed calm. If trust broke, law stepped in harder. Sometimes the state went even further. During severe shortages, the government directly distributed food. Private sellers were ordered to cooperate. Refusing could bring punishment. This was not socialism in the modern sense. It was emergency management. Rome believed that private profit must bend during public crisis. Another interesting aspect was forced sales. In some cases, sellers were required to sell at state-set prices, even if it meant loss. This sounds brutal, but from Rome's view, collapse was worse. A seller could recover from loss. A city could not recover from starvation easily. Markets were also tied to religion and festivals. During major public events, sellers were expected to operate. Crowds needed food. Pilgrims needed supplies. Closing during festivals disrupted order, so attendance was expected. This made festivals smoother and kept people fed and distracted. Distraction mattered. Rome knew that idle, hungry crowds were dangerous. Busy, fed crowds were manageable. The law made sure of that. Shopkeepers were part of the system whether they wanted to be or not. They were private individuals performing public functions. That tension never went away. Some sellers tried to avoid rules by claiming illness or lack of stock. Sometimes this worked. Sometimes inspectors showed up anyway, and inspectors had broad authority. They could search storage areas, check inventories, question staff. Rome did not believe in privacy when survival was at stake. There was also punishment for false scarcity. Pretending to be out of stock while hiding goods was a serious offense. It could lead to confiscation of all inventory. Public humiliation was possible too. Rome liked shame as a deterrent. People learned quickly. Interestingly, these laws protected consumers and sellers at the same time. By forcing everyone to stay open, competition stayed fair. No one could profit by being the only seller. That reduced resentment between merchants. It also reduced violence. Angry crowds often targeted sellers accused of price gouging. By controlling markets, Rome reduced that risk. Shopkeepers complained, but they stayed alive. Rome preferred living complainers to dead rebels. Markets were also places of information. News traveled fast through stalls and counters. If shops closed, information slowed. That mattered during emergencies. Open markets meant faster rumor correction. Officials could spread announcements. Crowds gathered predictably. This helped control narratives. Rome understood communication better than we often think. Markets were social media loud, messy, influential, so they were regulated. As the sun moved across the sky, markets stayed open, shutters stayed lifted, voices kept calling, even when sellers were tired, even when profits were low. The law did not care about comfort. It cared about continuity. At sunset, shops finally closed, stalls packed away, goods secured. The city exhaled. Another day without hunger riots, another night of order. Most Romans never thought about why shops stayed open. They just noticed when they didn't. And when that happened, fear followed quickly. Rome had seen it before, so it wrote laws to prevent it from happening again. In the next chapter, we leave markets and enter the strictest world of all, the Roman army, a place where discipline was enforced, not just by fines or shame, but by death. And where the law decided that sometimes punishing everyone was the safest option. For now, the market quiets, coins stop clinking, voices fade, and Rome rests, fed not just by grain but by rules that kept the shelves from ever looking empty. If Roman civilian life was tightly regulated, military life was something else entirely. For a Roman soldier, the law did not just guide behavior, it hovered constantly, like a blade. Every step, every command, every mistake. Because the Roman army was not built on bravery alone, it was built on obedience. Rome did not assume soldiers would always be loyal. It assumed the opposite. Fear, exhaustion, hunger, and boredom could break even disciplined men. So Rome designed military law to work under the worst conditions imaginable: cold, heat, long marches, enemy territory. The goal was simple: make disobedience more terrifying than the enemy. One of the most famous examples of this was decimation. Decimation was not a myth, it was real. If a unit mutinied, fled, or disobeyed orders, 1 out of every 10 men could be executed, chosen by lot, not because they were guilty, but because they belonged to the group. This sounds horrifying, and it was. But from Rome's perspective, it solved several problems at once. It punished failure, it reinforced collective responsibility, and it terrified everyone who survived. The randomness was the point. You could be brave, you could be loyal, but if your unit failed, you still suffered. That made soldiers police each other. If someone hesitated, others forced him forward. If someone talked of desertion, others silenced him. The law turned fear inward. The army regulated almost everything: sleeping arrangements, marching order, weapon maintenance, even personal appearance. A dull sword was a punishable offense. So was leaving formation. So was arguing with an officer. Why so extreme? Because Rome knew chaos spread quickly in armies. One mistake could cascade into disaster. A soldier breaks rank, others follow. Formation collapses. The enemy notices, so discipline had to be absolute. Roman soldiers also faced harsh punishment for desertion. Desertion was not treated as weakness, it was treated as betrayal. Punishments ranged from execution to public humiliation. Sometimes deserters were beaten, branded, or forced into shameful roles. The message was clear: leaving the army was worse than dying in it. Again, this was not cruelty for its own sake, it was risk management. An army that could not trust its own men was already defeated. Rome also used collective punishment regularly. If a guard fell asleep on duty, the entire unit could suffer. Extra labor, reduced rations, public reprimands. Why punish everyone? because guarding was not a solo job. Everyone depended on everyone else. If one man slept, others should have noticed. Shared punishment created shared vigilance. Roman commanders were legally empowered to enforce discipline on the spot. There was no long appeal process. In the field, hesitation killed, so officers had wide authority. They could beat soldiers, confiscate pay, assign brutal labor. This power could be abused, but Rome accepted that risk. It preferred occasional abuse to widespread disobedience. There were also strict rules about loot. Soldiers were not allowed to take whatever they wanted. Looting without permission was illegal. This surprised many enemies. Roman armies did not instantly dissolve into chaos after victory. They stayed organized. That was because loot distribution was regulated. Stealing outside the system brought punishment. Why control loot? Because uncontrolled looting broke discipline. Men scattered. Formations dissolved. Ambushes became easy. Rome wanted victories to be survivable. Loot came later. Even marching pace was regulated. Soldiers carried heavy packs. Complaining did not help. Marching too slowly or too fast disrupted formation. That was a punishable offense. Uniformity mattered more than comfort. Roman military law also controlled speech. Questioning orders publicly was forbidden. Criticism was allowed only in specific contexts, usually after action. On campaign, silence and compliance ruled. Debate slowed reaction time, and reaction time was life. Interestingly, Roman discipline laws applied to officers too. Commanders could be punished for incompetence. Losing a battle due to negligence could lead to exile or worse. Rome did not excuse failure easily. Authority came with expectation. That balance helped maintain trust. Soldiers knew officers were not untouchable, but in the moment, they obeyed without hesitation. One of the most psychologically powerful aspects of Roman discipline was routine. Soldiers drilled constantly, even during peace, especially during peace. Bored armies were dangerous armies, so Rome kept soldiers busy, building roads, digging ditches, constructing camps. Every night, even in friendly territory, soldiers built fortified camps. This was exhausting, but it created habit. When danger came, routines held. The law required this discipline. Skipping camp construction was punishable. Why? Because Rome did not believe safety was automatic. Every night was treated as hostile. This mindset saved lives. Roman camps became legendary. Order inside chaos. Law also regulated how soldiers interacted with civilians. Unauthorized violence was punished. Rape, theft, or assault could lead to execution. Rome wanted its armies feared, but not uncontrollable. An army that abused locals created resistance. Resistance created endless war. So discipline protected strategy. This may sound surprisingly humane, but it was still self-interest. Rome wanted provinces stable. A disciplined army was quieter. Quieter armies cost less to control. Military law also governed retreat. Retreating without orders was illegal, even when retreat made sense. Why? Because panic spreads faster than reason. Rome preferred controlled withdrawal to spontaneous flight, and that required law-backed obedience. Some soldiers died obeying bad orders. Rome accepted that too. One dead soldier was less dangerous than a routed army. This logic is cold, but it built an empire. Roman soldiers lived knowing that punishment might come from behind as easily as from the front. Enemy ahead, law behind. That pressure shaped behavior deeply. Many soldiers internalized discipline completely. They became harsh, quiet, efficient. They survived. There is an irony here. Roman soldiers endured some of the harshest laws in history, and yet, service was still desirable. Why? Because the rewards were real. Pay land grants, citizenship for non-citizens. Military service was a path upward, but only for those who endured the law. Discipline was the price of belonging. Rome did not hide this. Recruits knew what they signed up for, and the law made sure they remembered. Over time, this system created something unique, an army that could operate far from home. For years, in hostile environments, that was Rome's true superpower. Not weapons, not numbers, law. Law followed the army everywhere, written, understood, feared. And because it was consistent, soldiers trusted it. They knew what would happen if they failed. Uncertainty kills morale. Predictable punishment sustains it. As night fell on the camp, sentries took their positions. Others slept lightly. Armor nearby, weapons ready. Silence broken only by ordered movement. This was not comfort. This was control. And control kept them alive. In the next chapter, We leave the battlefield and return to the city, to nightfall, curfews, and the laws that controlled how Romans slept or didn't. For now, the camp stands firm. Ditches dug, walls raised, rules obeyed. Rome rested, confident that its soldiers feared the law enough to face anything else. When night fell in ancient Rome, freedom narrowed, not disappeared, but tightened. Darkness was not romantic to Romans. It was dangerous. No streetlights, no police patrol cars, no emergency numbers. Night hid fires, thieves, and riots equally well. So Rome did not trust it. Instead, it regulated it. Sleeping, moving, and even carrying light after dark all came with rules. This was not about comfort. It was about keeping the city alive until morning. Rome burned often. Buildings were packed tightly together. Most were made of wood, plaster, and cheap materials. Cooking fires burned constantly. At night, fires spread faster. People slept. Winds picked up. Panic took longer to form. A single spark could destroy entire neighborhoods. So Rome tried to reduce risk before it started. One of the simplest tools was curfew, not always written as a modern "you must be inside" rule, but enforced through restrictions. Movement at night was suspicious by default. If you were outside after dark, you needed a reason, and preferably a light. Even then, that light was regulated. Torches were useful but dangerous. Open flames near wooden buildings caused fires, so Rome controlled who could carry them, when, and how. Dropping a torch and starting a fire could make you legally responsible for massive damage. This was not symbolic punishment. If your torch burned down a building, you paid. If it burned down several, your life might be ruined. So people were careful. Night walking became quiet, deliberate, cautious. Rome also organized night watches. These were early versions of firefighters and police combined. Watchmen patrolled streets, listening for trouble. They watched for smoke. They listened for cries. They noted unusual movement. Their authority came from law. Ignoring them was risky. Arguing with them was worse. The watch enforced silence in certain areas. Loud gatherings at night attracted attention fast. Why? Because crowds at night frightened officials. Daylight crowds could be seen and managed. Night crowds turned into mobs. So Rome discouraged nighttime gatherings. Taverns and bars existed, but their hours were controlled. Staying open too late could bring penalties. Alcohol plus darkness plus hunger was a bad equation. Rome had tested it. The results were ugly. Sleeping arrangements were also indirectly regulated. Many Romans lived in insulae, apartment buildings. These were tall, cramped, and poorly built. Fires spread quickly inside them, so residents were expected to sleep lightly. That sounds cruel, but it was practical. People kept water nearby. They listened for alarms. They knew escape routes. Some buildings had rules about where cooking was allowed. Violating those rules increased fire risk, and if your negligence caused a nighttime fire, consequences followed. Rome believed accidents were often preventable. The law reflected that belief. Nighttime crime was another concern. The dark hid thieves. Breaking and entering was easier, so Rome treated nighttime crimes more harshly. The same crime committed at night often carried heavier punishment. Why? Because it showed intent. If you stole during the day, maybe it was opportunistic. At night, it was planned. Planned crime threatened order more deeply, so penalties increased. This discouraged night activity among criminals, at least in theory. Rome also regulated noise at night. Shouting, singing, or causing disturbance could bring fines. Not because Romans hated fun, because sound was information. At night, a scream meant danger. If people screamed constantly, real emergencies were missed. Silence allowed alarms to matter, so the law encouraged quiet. Even celebrations had limits. Weddings and festivals were expected to wind down. Excessive nighttime noise was treated as reckless. Again, not moral judgment, risk management. Interestingly, some professions were allowed to work at night. Bakers often baked before dawn. Some labor happened early to avoid heat. These workers were known and tolerated. Unusual movement stood out more clearly. That made enforcement easier. Rome preferred predictable exceptions to unpredictable behavior. Even sleeping itself had a social layer. Elite Romans often slept lightly and briefly. Heavy sleep was associated with laziness. This cultural value aligned with legal reality. Being alert was praised. Sleeping too deeply could cost you property or life. Night was not for rest alone. It was for vigilance. There is a strange calm in this. Rome did not expect peace at night. It expected readiness. The city never fully slept. Someone was always awake. Watchmen walked. Servants listened. Soldiers guarded gates. Law extended into dreams. You were not free simply because you closed your eyes. If a fire broke out and you failed to respond, responsibility followed. Neighbors expected action. The law supported those expectations. Collective safety outweighed individual comfort. Rome accepted that fatigue was better than disaster. Over time, these rules shaped habits. People planned their days to avoid night travel. They ate earlier. They rested in short cycles. Night became smaller. Day carried most activity. That rhythm stabilized the city. Rome also feared conspiracy at night. Political plots thrived in darkness. Meetings held after sunset raised suspicion, so authorities paid attention. Nighttime secrecy implied danger. Even innocent gatherings could be misinterpreted. This discouraged plotting, at least openly. Once again, Rome chose prevention over trust. There was also a symbolic side. Darkness represented chaos in Roman thought. Light represented order. By regulating night, Rome symbolically extended daylight. Law became a torch. This is not poetic exaggeration. Roman writers explicitly linked darkness with danger and disorder. Law existed to push back against that. Curfews, watches, and torch laws were tools against chaos. Even the dead respected this boundary. Funerals were limited at night. Processions had rules. Death itself had hours. Night belonged to the city, not to individuals. One might think this made life oppressive. In some ways, it did, but it also made life predictable. People knew what was expected. They knew when to be home. They knew when to sleep. They knew when silence mattered. Predictability reduced fear. Fear caused unrest. Rome always worked backward from unrest. If a rule reduced unrest, it stayed. If it didn't, it changed. Night law stayed for centuries. That tells us something. As lamps dimmed and doors closed, Rome slowed. Not stopped. Slowed. Watchmen passed each other quietly. Dogs barked in the distance. Someone coughed behind a shutter. The city listened to itself, waiting. And when morning came, rules loosened again. Shops opened. Voices rose. Life resumed. Night had been survived. Once more. In the next chapter, we will look at the final boundary Rome enforced between order and chaos. The dead, why they were kept outside the city, and what happened when that rule was broken. For now, rest, not too deeply. Rome never fully slept. It simply closed its eyes, one open. One watching, protected by laws that understood darkness was not an enemy to defeat, but a risk to manage until dawn. In ancient Rome, death was everywhere. People died young. Illness spread fast. Accidents were common. Wars never fully stopped. And yet, the dead were not allowed inside the city. Not to live, not to rest, not to stay. This was not a suggestion. It was law. Roman law required that the dead be buried or cremated outside the city limits. No exceptions for wealth. No exceptions for fame. No exceptions for love. The living city and the dead had a boundary, and Rome guarded it carefully. At first glance, this might seem cold. Why force families to carry loved ones beyond the walls? Why line roads with tombs instead of keeping the dead close? The answer is simple. The dead were dangerous. Not in a ghost story way, in a very practical, Roman way. First, there were health concerns. Rome did not understand bacteria, but it understood decay. Bodies rotted. Rotting things smelled. Smells meant sickness. Mass death events, plagues, fires, wars were especially dangerous. If bodies piled up inside the city, disease followed quickly. So Rome removed the source. The dead went out. The living stayed in. Even cremation, which reduced decay, was regulated. Fires inside the city were already a threat. Burning bodies added risk. So cremations also happened outside the walls. Fire, death, and dense housing were a bad mix. Rome avoided it by law. But health was only part of the reason. There was also religious pollution. Romans believed death carried a kind of spiritual contamination, not evil but disruptive. Contact with the dead required purification. People who handled corpses performed rituals before rejoining daily life. Temples avoided death-related activity. The gods preferred cleanliness, allowing bodies inside the city, blurred sacred boundaries. Rome took boundaries seriously. Life and death were different states. The city belonged to the living. The dead had their own space. This separation made daily religious life easier. Priests could perform rituals without constant purification. Citizens could move freely without fear of spiritual contamination. Order remained intact. There was also a psychological reason. Rome was already crowded and stressful. Seeing death constantly would have weighed heavily on people. Funerals were emotional. Grief was contagious. Allowing burials inside the city would turn neighborhoods into mourning zones. Rome preferred to keep grief controlled. Funerals were allowed but regulated. Processions followed specific routes. Noise and display were limited. Timing mattered. Once the body reached the city gate, the living turned back. The dead continued alone. This created closure, a physical moment where life resumed. The roads outside the city became cities of the dead. Tombs lined major routes. Monuments stood close together. Travelers walked among them constantly. This was not hidden death, it was organized death. The message was clear. Remember, Uspat, do not live with us. Tombs were often inscribed with warnings. Do not disturb. Do not damage. Do not reuse. Grave violation was a serious crime. Stealing from the dead was punished harshly, not because the dead needed protection, but because order did. If tombs were not safe, families would fight. If families fought, unrest followed. Rome enforced peace even in mourning. Another reason for separation was property law. Burial sites were legally distinct. Once land became a grave, it changed status. It could not be sold easily. It could not be built over. Keeping graves outside the city prevented urban land from becoming unusable. Rome needed every inch of space. Inside the walls was for the living economy. Outside could be permanent. This mattered a lot. Cities that allowed inner-city burials quickly ran out of space. Rome avoided that mistake. Even emperors followed this rule. They were honored with massive tombs but outside the city. The mausoleum of Augustus stood beyond the old boundary. Power did not erase the rule. It reinforced it. Breaking the burial law was not common, but it happened. And when it did, it caused outrage. Illegally burying someone inside the city could lead to fines, forced removal, and ritual cleansing. The city had to be purified. That tells us how seriously Romans took this boundary. The law was not just administrative, it was emotional. It protected the feeling of the city. There was also fear of the restless dead. Romans believed that improperly buried bodies could become angry spirits. Ghosts haunted places where burial rules were ignored. So law and superstition worked together. Follow the law, and the dead stay calm. Break it, and trouble follows. Even criminals were affected. Executed criminals were often denied proper burial. Their bodies might be thrown into mass graves or left exposed. This was punishment beyond death. Not being buried correctly meant no peace. The law used burial as leverage. That may sound cruel, but in Roman thought, burial was part of belonging. Denying it removed a person from community even after death. On the other side, granting burial restored dignity. Even enemies could be buried properly once fighting ended. That was a sign of order returning. Rome believed that how you treated the dead reflected the health of the state. A city that respected burial respected itself. The separation of dead and living also shaped memory. Tombs along roads meant the dead were seen, but not central. You passed them. You read names. You remembered briefly. Then you moved on. This balanced remembrance and progress. Rome did not want to forget the dead. It wanted to keep moving. There is something deeply Roman in that. Respect, but distance. Honor, but control. Even family tombs followed strict rules. They could not expand endlessly. They could not block roads. They could not intrude on neighbors. Death was allowed, but only within lines, and those lines were drawn by law. At night, the roads outside the city felt different, quiet, still. Stone monuments watching travelers pass. The dead were present, but not overwhelming. The living felt safe inside the walls. That was the goal. Rome knew it could not eliminate death, so it organized it, gave it a place, gave it rules, and by doing so, it reduced fear. When death has rules, it becomes manageable, predictable, less terrifying. In times of crisis, these rules mattered even more. Plagues tested them, wars tested them. When bodies overwhelmed the system, panic followed. Rome responded by tightening enforcement, more mass graves, faster removal, stricter boundaries. Even in chaos, the rule held. Dead out. Living in that consistency helped Rome survive repeated disasters. As centuries passed, other cultures noticed. Roman burial laws spread across the empire. cities copied the system. Roads lined with tombs became common. This was Roman order exported. Not just roads and laws, but death management. In the end, this chapter is not really about death. It is about space. Who belongs where? What must be kept apart? Rome believed mixing things improperly caused collapse. Classes, roles, functions, and states of existence. Life and death were not enemies. They were neighbors with a wall between them. As dawn broke over the city, gates opened. Merchants entered. Travelers passed tombs. Life flowed inward. The dead stayed where they were, watching silently, waiting. In the final chapter, we will pull back and look at the pattern behind all these rules, why Rome regulated everything, and how that obsession with order kept the empire alive far longer than anyone expected. For now, the boundary holds, the city breathes, and the dead rest outside, where Roman law says they belong. And just like that, we've stepped out of ancient Rome where even the weirdest rules often had surprisingly smart reasons behind them. From controlling chaos in crowded streets to keeping social order in a massive empire, these laws remind us that history is rarely as simple as it looks. If you enjoyed uncovering the strange logic of the ancient world, don't forget to like this video. It really helps the channel grow. Subscribe for more.com/fascinating dives into history and turn on notifications so you don't miss what's coming next. Now, we'd love to hear from you which Roman rules surprised you the most, or which one do you think actually makes sense today? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if you're not ready to leave the past just yet, check out the videos on screen for more strange, forgotten, and quietly fascinating moments from history. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next journey through time.